Okay, continuing with the U.S. before World War II, we're now going to take a look at the final steps toward war and U.S. entry into the war. Um, we're going to look at how U.S. policy was changing and how Japan was reacting to these policy changes. So, in the last lesson, we talked about this right here: isolationism versus neutrality, the Neutrality Acts through the 1930s and how they began to change towards the end of the 30s. Um, and then we also talked about FDR's quarantine speech. So now we're going to progress from there. So, how did the US response to growing escalation in Asia and Europe change over time? Okay. So, as we discussed before, there were the Neutrality Acts. Towards the end of the decade, we have loosening of the Neutrality Acts. First in 37 with the cash and carry for arms that we discussed, and then in 1939, cash and carry for all trade. So that's an erosion of complete neutrality. In September of 1940, we had both the Selective Training and Service Act as well as the Destroyers for Bases Agreement. The Selective Training and Service Act was the first peacetime draft in the history of the U.S. This was passed reluctantly by Congress, which added a provision that troops could only be deployed in defense of the U.S. So, with this peacetime draft, there was the provision that troops could not be sent to protect German civilians or protect the British or protect the Chinese or protect the French. They could only be sent to in defense of the U.S. Okay. And then we have the Destroyers for Bases deal, which boils down to the fact that the British needed ships. They did not have enough naval fighting ships, and a lot of the war was going to be fought on the ocean. Churchill was begging FDR for months up until this time, all summer, spring and summer before this, asking for naval destroyers to fight the Germans. They were afraid, especially after the Germans invaded France, that the Germans would take over the French fleet and all of their naval bases. But FDR didn't think that he could provide this without approval from Congress. And he didn't think he would get it. So he was telling Churchill no. And basically, after months of negotiation, the agreement was made that yes, the U.S. would provide the British with some older naval ships. Historians will say obsolete ships because the U.S. wasn't going to use them anymore. But what the U.S. got in exchange was 99-year leases, land leases, in land in Newfoundland and in the Caribbean for U.S. Naval bases and naval air bases. Now, in January of 1941, FDR gave what's known as the Four Freedoms speech. Um, this was a speech that was his 1941 State of the Union address, the State of the Union to the Congress. And in this, he outlined what is known as the Four Freedoms. He outlined these freedoms as those which ought to be afforded to everyone in the world. Worldwide, every human on the planet should have freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And what was meant by that was, well, of course, the freedom of speech and the freedom of worship both come from the U.S. Bill of Rights, and those were seen, especially back then, as basic human rights, um, by FDR that should be proclaimed to the world, because in Europe at this time, fascism was taking over and communism in the Soviet Union, and there was not freedom of speech and freedom of worship. Um, Now, freedom from want, he explains, is um, the freedom that people should not want for basic needs, as far as basic economic needs, food, clothing, shelter, work, opportunity, all the things that he thought government could help provide, as he was through the New Deal. Freedom from fear was the idea that people should be able to live in peace in their home. Freedom from fear of oppression by their government, and oppression from military, fear of being run out of their homes, or fear from being killed for beliefs or speech. So, this really was an indication to the world of where FDR was going, um, with his beliefs of neutrality and isolationism. That, we could stay within our four corners, um, but really that there was more of a moral obligation to the people of the world to stand up for these four freedoms. Okay, now we're going to take a look at this timeline here that shows the escalation between the US and Japan before the war. This timeline is going to help us answer two questions. First, how did the US response to Japan's actions change over time? And then second, how did Japan perceive the actions of the United States? So how were the actions of the US changing, and what did Japan think about those actions? So, the first thing is the U.S. orders a ban on the transport of weapons to China or Japan on any ship flying the American flag. Now, you remember this was part of the Neutrality Acts, um, and part of the cash and carry provision, where U.S. ships could not carry arms, only those purchasing. Okay, in December of 1937, the U.S. demands that Japan give a full apology and pay for losses on American ships. This goes back to an incident where there was a convoy of American ships in the area to help evacuate staff from the American embassy in China. Okay, and so the Japanese knew this, that the U.S. were there kind of in support of China, really just getting their citizens out. But Japan attacked these ships, sinking many of the ships, killing 3 people. So, not huge losses, but huge losses in the sinking of ships and just the attack in the first place. And so the US demanded an apology, and they got one, and they accepted it, and there was no other action taken. In May of 1938, the U.S. discourages the export of planes or aircraft parts to Japan. Okay, so you'll know that in the Neutrality Acts, there was already a ban of sales for arms and ammunition and any kind of wartime support. However, planes and aircraft parts specifically were not necessarily considered to be arms until this. And so, of course, Japan was not happy of no longer having that easy supply from the U.S. for their aircraft. In October of 1938, the U.S. loans China $25 million to defend itself against Japan. Now, again, going back to the Neutrality Acts, this wasn't necessarily allowed. However, FDR got around being able to loan money to a belligerent nation by saying that China wasn't really a belligerent nation because Japan never officially declared war on China. And so Japan was an invading force and China was just sitting there defending themselves. They they hadn't invaded, they hadn't declared war, Japan hadn't declared war. And so the US got around that provision that way. In September of 1940, the US pressures Britain to reopen the Burma Road. Now, the Burma Road was a supply route for the Chinese. And so to get war supplies and just any supplies, they needed this Burma Road. The Japanese had convinced the British during earlier negotiations to close that road, and that was supposed to be kind of a treat for Japan to be able to keep them at the negotiating table and to get other concessions and help get things under control. However, the US saw that this wasn't working and successfully gets Britain to reopen the Burma Road. And of course, Japan was not happy about that. In 1941, the U.S. freezes all Japanese assets in the U.S., and that's pretty self-explanatory. Any money that Japanese citizens or government entities or businesses had in the U.S. were frozen, couldn't access money in the bank, couldn't access property, couldn't buy or sell property. And then here in September 1941, the U.S. rejects Japan's plan for settling issues in Asia. Now we're going to look at a document that came out of the conference in September of 1941 that was Japan's plan for settling issues in Asia. It's a little bit complicated, and so I'm going to read it out loud to you and kind of explain that a little bit, and then move on to entry to the war. So let's look at what came out of the conference as part of Japan's plan for settling issues in Asia that the U.S. ends up rejecting. So here we go. Decision following the Imperial Conference of September 6, 1941. This is a translation because, of course, it was in Japanese. Lines of action in the execution of Japan's national policy. Decision following the Imperial Conference of September 6, 1941. In view of the critical situation at present, especially the hostile attitude assumed by America, Britain, and the Netherlands, the situation of the Soviet Union, and the resiliency of Japanese national power, the measures vis-a-vis the southern regions mentioned in the lines of action of Japan's national policy to be pursued according to the changing situation will be carried out set forth hereunder. Number 1, in order to ensure self-preservation and self-defense, Japan, under the resolve to risk a war with America, Britain, and the Netherlands, will go forward with war preparations, which are to be completed sometime toward the latter part of October. Number 2, parallelly, within the foregoing measure, Japan will strive to establish fully her claims by diplomatic means vis-a-vis American and Britain. In the negotiations with America, Britain, the minimum Japanese requirements which must be fulfilled and the limits of the occasion Japan can agree to make will be set forth in the appendix. Number 3, in case there is no prospect by the early part of October of pushing through Japanese claims by diplomatic means, as mentioned in the preceding paragraph, Japan will forthwith decide upon war against America, Britain, and the Netherlands. As regards the measures relating to matters over the southern region, they will be carried forward according to the national policy as has already been decided upon. Special efforts will be exerted to prevent American and the Soviet Union forming a united front against Japan. Okay, that is very wordy and very confusing, so we're going to break it down. That intro paragraph at the top, in view of the critical situation at present, that is what we were just looking at as the progression from total neutrality of the U.S. towards slowly more and more picking a side. Number 1 is saying that even though Japan has been under pressure to stop with their war efforts, they're not going to. Number two says at the same time, we're going to try to be diplomatic and talk to the US and Britain and the Netherlands. Um, but that there is a minimum that, there are minimum requirements that, basically a red line that Japan's not going to cross. It says it's going to be set forth in the appendix. We don't have that information. But it's basically that Japan is going to continue with their efforts in China, and that the US and Britain shouldn't care about aggression specifically toward China. And then in number three, it basically says if we can't come to a diplomatic agreement, we're risking war. When it talks about the southern region, it's talking about the southern region of China, because basically Japan was trying to go south in China to get their land so as not to complicate things to the north with the Soviet Union, right? The Soviet Union southern border is the Chinese northern border in parts of Asia. And so that's basically what this statement is saying, is like, hey, US and Britain, we see you and we're going to keep doing our thing anyway. In August of 1941, we have the Atlantic Charter. Now, the Atlantic Charter was a document signed by FDR and Churchill in August of 41, which just laid out some common principles between the nations that both held, that were, quote, based on their hopes for a better future of the world. So the purpose of this Atlantic Charter was, first of all, symbolic. It was supposed to be a message of hope, to show the rest of the world that the US and Britain were allied, even though there was nothing, official, because the US wasn't in the war yet. It was a symbolic gesture to show that the US was indeed supporting Britain. And it just laid out these common principles. World Organization. There was a throwback to the Four Freedoms speech that was included here, in a clause that called for safety within national borders, freedom from fear and want. That was almost exactly taken from the Four Freedoms speech. There were pieces of the charter that talked about peace organization for the world in the future, talking about labor standards, economic advancement, social security for the world, basic principles of international justice. So that was the Atlantic Charter, and this was signed in Newfoundland, is where that was hosted. And then lastly, we have the Lend-Lease Act. And the Lend-Lease Act was the final unofficial stepping away from the Neutrality Acts. It said that the U.S. could now lend or lease rather than sell war supplies to any nation that it deemed vital to the defense of the United States. Okay, and so it allowed the U.S. to supply military aid to its allies while still officially and technically remaining neutral. And now officially, to wrap up this part of the timeline, okay, we come back down. September of 41, the U.S. rejects Japan's plan for how they wanted to settle issues in Asia. In November of 41, the U.S. rejects Japan's request to be able to purchase oil from the U.S. again. The U.S. wants to thwart their war efforts with that. And then in December of 1941, as we will learn,
there are many among us who in the past closed their eyes to events abroad because they believed that what was taking place in Europe was none of our business. that we could maintain our physical safety by retiring within our continental boundaries. To those who would not admit the possibility of the approaching storm, the past weeks have meant the shattering of many illusions.
With a third of Europe now under Nazi control, America still sits on the sidelines. Many believe the war to be Europe's problem. Recalling the horrors of World War I, the majority of Americans don't want to get involved in another European war. President Franklin Roosevelt attempts to convince them otherwise. On September 16, 1940, Roosevelt signs the Selective Training and Service Act, the first peacetime draft in American history. All able-bodied men between 21 and 30 must register for military service. Though Congress approves the bill, it is careful to call it a national defense measure. The draftees may only be sent to defend American-held territories. 2 years ago, the United States had the 17th largest army in the world, smaller than tiny Romania's. And almost 2/3 of American recruits have never fired a rifle. By the summer of 1941, Hitler is ready to launch his forces further east. In June, his armies invade the Soviet Union. By September, they have captured over 1.4 million Soviet troops. In November, Germany, Japan, and Italy renew their military alliance. All agreed to safeguard their common interests. The Axis powers are ready to carve up the world.
Washington. The White House announces Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The facts of yesterday and today speak for themselves. The people of the United States have already formed their opinions and well understand the implications to the very life and safety of our nation.
4 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Germany and Italy declare war on the United States. It is the first and only time Hitler actually declares war on another nation. Across the U.S., panic spreads as Americans realize they have enemies off both coasts. Surging above the fear is a wave of patriotism and outrage. Within 30 days of the attack, over 134,000 young men enlist for service, ready to take the fight to the enemy. The wars in Europe and Asia now merge into a single gigantic world war, the largest war in history.